Welcome back everyone. It's been a while since my last proper upload, so let's make this a longer one. A while back I made a video where I discussed Thomas's growth and maturity throughout the classic series. It was a fun video to work on, and you guys seemed to really enjoy it. In case you missed it, I also made a small point about Thomas's friendship with Edward. As we all know, the later seasons would push Thomas and Percy closer together, eventually dubbing them as best friends. However, in my video, I said that I would consider Edward to be Thomas's true best friend, at least throughout the first 5 seasons, even if he and Thomas didn't actually see each other that way. A lot of you guys seem to agree with this statement, and when I said that I might do a video on it, you were all for it. So that's the topic of today's video. We're going to take a look at these two characters and their relationship as established in the original Railway series and later the classic era of the show, and see if these two really are best friends. I will also dedicate a small section of this video to some moments between them that I think are worth mentioning that take place outside of the classics. I also made a Twitter and a community post about this very topic. And I'll be sharing some of the opinions you guys shared with me, as some of you had some really interesting things to say. If you enjoy this video and want to see more like it, then don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and ring Toby's bell to stay notified for when I post new content. Now then, with all of that out of the way, let's get started. Analysing these two and their first interactions aren't actually going to be that hard. Edward was introduced in the first book ever, and was actually the first character introduced altogether, whereas Thomas made his debut in the second book. Edward is depicted as an older, outdated engine, which leads to a lot of the newer and bigger engines looking down upon him.
The driver won't choose you again. He wants big, strong engines like us.
Despite this, however, Edward consistently proves that he is just as capable as any other engine on the Fat Controller's railway. Perhaps the most determined of all engines, Edward has faced numerous trials and has overcome all of them, pushing through where others might have given up. Determination aside, Edward is also seen to be a kind, sympathetic, and wise old sage. He is known for being a voice of reason, but also a stern and fair teacher to younger engines. Thomas, in his truest form, seems to be the complete opposite to Edward, at least at first glance. When Thomas debuted, he was depicted as young, arrogant, brash, cocky, hot-headed, impatient, and overly cheeky. He would frequently tease and prank the bigger engines, just because he thought he could get away with it.
Wake up, lazy bones! Do some hard work for a change. You can't catch me! And he ran off laughing.
Thinking that he was better than everyone else, Thomas almost never listened to advice and frequently got himself into trouble. However, after saving a runaway James, Thomas showed that deep down, he does have a good heart. Over the years he would mellow out somewhat as a character, but he never strayed too far from his arrogant, boastful, and easily offended nature. In the classic series, these versions of the characters remained virtually identical to their Railway series counterparts, with perhaps the biggest exception being Thomas's gradual maturity over the first 5 seasons. So now that we've established who these characters are, it may seem that these two would be at odds with each other, and if that was how their relationship was portrayed, it would have made perfect sense. But no, Thomas and Edward have never had a full-blown argument or been seen to be at odds with each other. In fact, Edward is one of the few characters that Thomas fully respects. The only other two are Toby, who Thomas decided was cool after he frightened the policeman that was mean to him, and possibly Gordon, whom he had formed an alliance with after their most humiliating and humbling incidents. Now this is all well and good, but you may have noticed something. Thomas learned to respect Toby and Gordon, whereas he was shown to respect Edward right from the very start. Granted, we never see Thomas's initial disdain for Toby, but it is mentioned.
At first, Thomas was jealous.
While we don't know what Thomas's initial relationship with Edward was like in times set before their earliest depictions, we can infer that they would have grown close rather quickly. For you see, according to the official law that Wilbur Awdry established, Edward and Thomas were the first two engines onto Topham Hatt's railway and helped to build the main line before officially joining the fleet. As a result, the two would have initially spent a lot of time working together, and most likely only had each other to turn to. As a result, their friendship is a great one, with both characters respecting one another. Their respect for each other is shown in different ways, of course, with it being a reflection of their own identities and personalities. Edward's respect for Thomas is shown when he offers to switch jobs with him in order to give the tank engine a change, or when he lends an ear to Thomas's grievances. Thomas shows his respect for Edward when he is one of the few engines to actually defend his colleague from the bigger engines. This would continue into later seasons. As we all know, Thomas loves to tease others. Edward isn't exempt from this. However, it is a lot more light-hearted whenever Thomas does tease him, and I personally find it quite endearing. Compare Thomas's teasing of characters like Gordon and James in Season 1 to his teasing of Edward in seasons beyond.
Wake up, lazy bones. Do some hard work for a change. You can't catch me. Here are your trucks, James. Have you got some bootlaces ready? Toasty! I'm going to the scrapyard today, Edward called to Thomas. What? Already? You're not that old, replied Thomas cheekily.
I'm on my way to pick up the brass band.
Don't crack your smoke box.
To me, this shows just how high of a regard that Thomas holds Edward, as he's essentially telling the old engine that he's still more than useful in the first clip, and basically tells him not to overdo it in the latter. I also love it when we get to see Thomas defend his older colleague, as it shows his good-hearted nature that is often buried beneath his outer arrogance. Perhaps one of the best examples comes from the story Old Iron. In this story, James berates Edward for being old and slow, only for Thomas, and by extension Percy, to immediately clap back and stick up for the old blue guy.
Old Iron? Slow? Why, Edward could beat you in a race any day.
Side note, I am so embarrassed that I missed this in my video on Thomas's growth. I thought about it whilst writing the script, and even while I was editing the video, yet I for some reason just never included it. Anyway, I think one of the reasons as to why this particular example stands out to me so much is because if you're watching the TV show's version of it, then it takes place in Season 2, where Thomas is potentially at his worst in the classic era, as he is almost always rude and or arrogant towards most of the other engines. Edward is the most obvious exception. I can imagine that if they had had an interaction in Better Late Than Never, Thomas would have been a tad more lenient with Edward if he had arrived late, in comparison to someone like James or Henry. In Season 3, when Thomas tries to help Bertie get the road mended by finding the missing tar wagon, Edward is the first person he turns to. I think this shows that Thomas looks to Edward for advice, wisdom, and insight. Makes sense to me, as Season 3 is the one where Thomas is at his kindest and wisest, making him the most similar character to Edward at that point in time. Yes, even more so than Toby. In Season 4, Edward is the one who is keen for Thomas to meet Stepney, possibly believing that they would get along well, which they do in the end. I think that it's fair to say that these two bring out the best in each other, and I think some of the best examples of this come from outside of the Railway series, and even the classics. Let's take a look, shall we? Now this section will focus on the characters in the hit model era of the show, as well as the CGI series. Although bear with me because I am not as familiar with the latter. As we all know, the hit era onwards did a lot of characters dirty. Their personalities were often reduced to a single aspect of who they truly were, and sometimes they were just completely and utterly wrong. Thomas, and especially Edward, were not exempt from this. However, one thing that was fortunately left intact was their friendship. There are several episodes in the hit model series that show the audience that despite everything, these two still have each other's backs. In Season 8, Thomas, and again Percy, defend Edward when Gordon and James are bitching and whining about him for being chosen for the race against Spencer. In the same season, Edward is the one to put Gordon in his place after he puts Thomas down, and is also one of the two engines that helps the exhausted tank engine fix his mistakes. He's also the one who asks Harold to find Thomas after he goes missing. In Season 9's Saving Edward, Thomas does his best to cover Edward's duties whilst he is struggling with his workload, due to his age and being in need of repairs. While I won't defend Edward's self-doubt in this episode, as he should know by now that the Fat Controller would never scrap him, I do admittedly love how we see Thomas encourage his friend and even lie just to try and keep him out of trouble. Yeah, it's a pretty stupid and, quite frankly, unbelievable lie, but this is still something that I can genuinely see Thomas doing for Edward. You know what? Fuck it. I might have to do a video on this episode because I just have so much to say about it. In the absolutely atrocious Season 10 episode, Edward Strikes Out, Thomas is the one to set Edward straight and realise that they do in fact need Rocky's help. Now I do hate this episode with a burning passion, but I will give it this one tiny thing. If Edward ever did something that was completely out of character, then it makes sense that Thomas would be the one to set him straight. Edward in his truest form does this all the time, and he would undoubtedly do it for Thomas, so it makes sense that Thomas would return the favour. I feel one missed opportunity to see a little more of the relationship is the scene in The Great Discovery where Edward is taking Thomas to the works, and Thomas gets jealous of Stanley. Could have been a good opportunity for Edward to pipe up and share some of his wisdom and insight. Now, as I'm sure a lot of you know by this point, I am not super familiar with the CGI series, but I do want to quickly discuss one episode that stands out to me, one that I feel perfectly uses both characters, and that is Old, Reliable Edward. This is one of those Edward and Gordon clones, where Edward proves he's not a useless engine to the others, mostly Gordon, so it's nothing new in concept. But it's the way the story is told that I feel makes it work so well, and really shows us just how much Thomas looks up to Edward. When Thomas catches wind of Gordon being an ungrateful dick to Edward, he tricks Gordon into a race, knowing that the big blue engine would of course be unable to resist the temptation to show off. Gordon of course accepts, and even makes the mistake of giving Thomas a head start. Thomas then switches onto Gordon's line and forces him to go so slow that he gets stuck on the hill. Then when it becomes apparent he can't climb the hill on his own, Gordon is forced to swallow his pride and ask Edward for help, while simultaneously accepting that the blue engine is just as useful as all the others on Sodor. This feels very classic and Railway series inspired to me. You've got the pompous Gordon receiving humility, you've got good old Edward saving the day, and you've also got the young cheeky Thomas, who both still plays tricks on the others, but also looks up to Edward. Nice. Now before we wrap up, I want to quickly go over some of your guys' thoughts on these two. About a month and a half ago, probably more than that now, I made a Twitter and community post asking what everyone thinks of these two's relationship. A lot of people claim that they have a very familial relationship. Some said they were like father and son, some said grandfather and grandson, and some even said that they were like brothers. I'm not sure which of these labels I would attach to these two, but I will highlight some of what I think are the most interesting answers that I got. Now please bear with me, because I got a lot of responses, so sorry if I didn't highlight yours. Feel free to let everyone know what you think of Thomas and Edward in the comments. Now the first one is from Twitter, and this really caught my attention. First up is Brad Blessed Boy Dodson, who says, "I always imagined it as a father-son-esque dynamic. One of my favourite moments in the entire franchise was when Thomas was talking about Philip, and Edward said it reminded him of another little tank engine who wanted to see the world. Too sweet, and shows their history together. Honestly, that is really wholesome." The Evil Dalek 5452 on YouTube said, "If I had to define it in one word, it would be respect." Yes, while I feel like Thomas would occasionally joke about Edward, I get the feeling of mutual understanding between the two. Edward knows Thomas doesn't and would never mean it, and I feel Edward is perhaps the only engine Thomas fully 100% respects all the way. The two built the Northwestern together, and so there is that unknown and confidential relationship between the two. Only they know how they first interacted and how they grew to respect each other, with not even the viewer knowing, and honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way. What's truly important is they know they're friends and that they respect each other, and when we see anyone try and put Edward down when Thomas is around, he, without a second thought, stands by him. It may not be shown a lot on screen or in books, but Edward and Thomas, I believe, have probably the most respectful relationship in the entire series. I honestly couldn't have said that better myself, even if I tried. Okay, time for one more. The Doctor 654 caught my eye with this one. To put it simply, I would say Tencent and Hercules, because if you compare them, the relationship is similar, because in one script they were brothers, and I see similarities with Thomas and Edward. Huh, that's very true. I can't believe I never made that connection before. Thomas and Edward have had a very turbulent life throughout the series, what with inconsistent writing and all that. But one thing that has remained consistent is their friendship, and the close bond that they share. Even if they don't necessarily view each other as best friends, they do define what it means to be true friends. And that is something truly wonderful. Well, that's just about gonna do it for this video, everyone. When I first mentioned the friendship between these two in my prior video, I honestly didn't expect to do a full-length video on it. But you guys seem really keen for it, and as I look further into it, I too was really eager to take a look at these two. At the time I'm writing this, I'm not sure what my next project will be. It will either be the James and the Diesels video, or the first of a two-part mini-series. Either way, stay tuned. Now until next time, I've been Cinders and Ashes UK, you've been awesome, and have a great day. Bye!